How's everybody this fine Oshkosh day?
We've got too much lead.
Too much lead. Well, let's see what we can do to get the lead out today. The process has been going on for 40 years. When the Obama administration came in 2008 and 9, the EPA got hyperactive and we had a panic. I remember being at an AOPA convention in Orlando, I think, and it was like pandemonium. Everybody running around, shaking their arms, dancing, you know. And because of the business, our Tornado Alley Turbo business, we can't live without high-performance fuel. So it was an existential threat to us. On the trip on the way home, Tim and I were flying in my turbo-normalized Bonanza, and we had a discussion. What most people don't realize is that our little company in Ada, once we built that engine test facility and got it operational in 2001, we had a string of major petroleum companies that contacted us privately and asked us to do detonation and performance testing on their in-house proprietary blends of fuel because they didn't want somebody else to do it and they didn't want a public agency to do it and they didn't have the in-house capability. So we acquired an enormous amount of experience in doing fuel evaluation and testing from 2002 through about 2008. And the most important aspect of that was we learned an awful lot about what does not work. That's really important, to know what does not work. And so Tim and I thought we had some ideas that we could put together. We started that, I believe, in October, started blending fuels. The way we operate there, we can blend a drum of fuel in the morning, put 50 gallons up on a rack for the test stand at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, be done testing it by 3 o'clock, analyze the results, and do a rinse, wash, and repeat the next day. It was our ability to do that cycle like that, which we did probably 25 or 30 times in October, November, early December, and that led us to begin to file the STC application with the FAA. Unfortunately, that was 14 years ago. It only took 12 years to get a fleet-wide approval for all of the spark ignition piston engines. So here we go. Speaking of all of the spark ignition piston engines, that includes the right engine on this airplane, which a week ago yesterday made the first flight ever made in a World War II bomber running on G100UL. And if you look pretty close, you see some guy sitting there in a blue shirt. I wouldn't have missed that for the world. You know, that's the old thing. They're standing there, they've got this strange fuel in the airplane, and the guy that in charge of the team that helped to develop it is standing there, and they're looking at me wanting to waiting for me to ask to go. I said, can I sit up front? So the topic for today is, I think, timely, and that is, will your engine survive unleaded avgas? Now, what precipitated this, a little background, and then I'm going to go through a lot of this really rapidly to try and have some question time. It's always fun to be time slotted right against a rattan. But I appreciate the full house that we have here today. So last October, the word came out about the problem at the University of North Dakota, and that created a big stink in the general aviation marketplace and the community and the pilots, because the constant refrain that you heard on the pilot message boards was, well, that was predictable. You know, lead is a lubricant, lead protects the valves, and so none of these unleaded fuels are going to work because they have to have lead to protect the valves. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the well-documented truth with an enormous amount of data to the contrary. So today, one of our themes is to simply ask you to believe the data. Let's focus on data. So we're going to press on, and so I'm going to have a little bit of fun, excuse me. Listen not to the GAMA and NATA chorus. That's the National Air Transport Association, and GAMA is the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Listen not to the GAMA and the NATA chorus loudly denouncing GAMI's FAA-approved AVGAS. So I'll take a little literary license. They are errant knaves all, believe none of them. That's paraphrasing some guy named William Shakespeare, Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. Those knaves have no data. So I've used this slide off and on for the last 14 years. I was standing here, I believe, in the summer of 2010. We had a tent forum here. It was on, oh horror, we're going to lose leaded avgas. The microphone was finally passed around to the president of Lycoming, Michael Kraft. And I remember specifically, actually wrote it down, the first words that he said to the crowd, about 3 or 4 times this size: we have to stop loving the problem and just fix it. This is not a new problem. In about 1930 or 31, some guy nobody's ever heard of named James Doolittle flew an airplane from Ottawa, Canada to Washington, D.C. to Mexico City. It was a high-performance airplane, speed plane racer. He had started using tetraethyl lead in his fuels, but he knew when he got to Mexico City they wouldn't have any leaded fuel, so he took a jug of tetraethyl lead with him, and on the flight into Mexico City it started leaking, and he got so sick he could hardly land the airplane. He later wrote about it and said, lead is not the solution. We need to find a better way to generate octane. Folks, that was 90 years ago. 90 years ago. We can do better. So I had the great pleasure last Saturday to bring a soon-to-be private pilot, put him in the left seat of our Cirrus, and exercised my ancient privileges as a flight instructor and monitored him while he got acquainted with a high-performance airplane, and he flew our turbo-normalized SR-22 flying on G100UL into Oshkosh. What a nice experience for a kid. He'd already taken his oral for his check ride, but he didn't able to take the flight test portion because of thunderstorms, guess where, in Oklahoma, and Tornado Alley, Oklahoma. And so he's waiting on his check ride, but he's going to make a great pilot. By the way, one question. Got any flight instructors in here? Anybody get their flight instructor certificate at or before the year 1967? One guy. Welcome to my club. Do you still have it, sir? Welcome to our double club. So nearly 2 years ago, the FAA issued a fleet-wide approval for all of the aircraft spark ignition piston engines for G100UL, and they also approved all of the airplanes. The rotorcraft are pending, but they're well along in the certification process. I had an hour-and-a-half meeting with the FAA on Tuesday, largely focused on that subject. So what you see here is the gas. This is a fairly aged bottle from about a year ago, but it tends to be green, yellow-green to blue-green, depending on. Thank you. It tends to be green to yellow-green to blue-green, depending on exactly when it was made, and then how much 100 low lead has been mixed with. So at Sun and Fun, the announcement was made that G100 UL gas is now commercially available. There's about 1.3 million gallons, I think, sitting in this tank right here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River. We can ship fuel by rail, by truck, by river barge, all the way, I guess, to Pittsburgh, and by ocean-going barge any place in the world. One foreign civil aviation authority has already gone through the work with the FAA and has done the Civil Aviation Authority peer-to-peer coordination, and that foreign civil aviation authority has now approved all of the STCs for use in their country, and they're in the process of purchasing fuel that would leave by ocean-going barge from this facility. So we have some of these little cards. How many people are here from the West Coast? Thank you. This card is directed for your attention. I've got a few of them. Tim Rail over here has got some of them, or you can come by the booth. Tim's right there by the tripod. We'd like for you to fill these out and let us know who your vendor is, so that, and you know, if you don't want the fuel there, then don't bother to fill it out. But I'm going to assume that if you go to the trouble to fill it out, that you want G100 UL available to you at your usual airport. So remember, the phrase of the day is believe the data. I think most of you that know us and have experience with us realize that we've got a 25+ year history of innovating and certifying a lot of really nice products. Many of you have. How many people in here have got GAMI injectors on their airplanes? Yeah, there's 36,000 sets of those out there right now. The turbo-normalized Cirrus that we did has got millions of trouble-free operating hours on that fleet of engines. So we've got a long history of innovating and certifying new products, innovative products. We've been Aviation Consumer Product of the Year several times. This is GAMI's Aircraft Engine Test Facility, otherwise known as the Carl Goulet Memorial Engine Test Facility, and that's a mouthful. Carl Goulet was the Vice President of Engineering at Continental for 25 or 30 years. He is the person that personally designed almost all of the Continental engines that are in use today. He retired, he became a DER, and we were using him on the GAMI injector project, and he pulled me aside one day and said, "George, you and Tim need to build a test cell." "Well, I don't want to do that, it's expensive, la-di-da-di-da." "No, you really do." "Well, why do we need to do that, Carl?" "Because you won't believe what you will learn and what you can do if you do that." He was right. So you see here also the control room. You see out here the tanks. I don't want you to, you think, why in the heck is he pointing out the tanks? Well, at the back of each one of those tanks is a solenoid valve. Is a solenoid valve that looks like this one, except it's got a coil up here. This is the diaphragm in the middle. We use solenoid valves at both ends. We use it out here where the tanks are, on all the multiple fuel lines that come back up into the engine here, and then there's a double parallel set of solenoid valves right there at the engine. So they work in parallel with each other. If you switch off one fuel, it switches two solenoids, so that in case one of them leaks, you don't get any contamination of fuel from one fuel type to another. Now, we'll come back to that subject. And then you can see the instrumentation here. It's at least modestly sophisticated. How many pilots in this room have been to an advanced pilot engine management seminar class? So every one of you has had time to watch an engine run standing in front of this console. Is that correct? All right. So that's kind of open and transparent. And that's been open and transparent to a lot of people that should have, but have failed to take advantage of the opportunity to investigate further. So we have consistently supported the introduction and acceptance of our products by providing very high quality engineering data. And today we're going to continue that tradition by bringing to you and the general aviation community some important data related to the ongoing effort to eliminate avgas. So here's some really good news coming up. Some of you have seen this. You can get a copy of it at our booth. It's on a rack there. This is not George Brawley's data. This is AOPA's data. God bless Mark Baker for putting in place that AOPA bearing program a year ago. It was delayed because they were getting the airplane, re-engined and new avionics and stuff. But late last October, 30th of October 31st, they brought the plane to Ada with about 10 or 12 hours of runtime on the engines from fresh overhaul. And we had the STC already on the plane. We put G100UL in the left wing, and the program was to keep 100 low lead in the right wing. So what you're looking at, and this is the really good news, is that the gray bars are the Blackstone Oil Analysis People's universal average for parts per million of wear metals of aluminum, chrome, iron, copper, molybdenum, and nickel. The green bar is the AOPA right-hand engine. We're at 200 hours now with multiple successive 50-hour oil analysis. All of them the same or similar. And the green bars down here, those G100UL avgas in the left-hand engine. Wear metals are down by 60% on average. And keep in mind, the right engine occasionally, the left engine with the G100 occasionally got run on 100 low lead. And every time it did, we'd see the lead spike up in the oil, and then it'd go away again. And we did that because sometimes they got stranded and had to fill up with 100 low lead in the left tank, or we did some cross-feeding in flight to record data appropriately. So I showed this data to the single most experienced propulsion engineer in the FAA about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he studied it a minute, and he looked at me and said, "George, when is GAMI going to submit an application for a project to begin extending the TBOs on all of these engines?" I hope that's good news to you. In addition, how many people in here have never cleaned a spark plug? Never cleaned a spark plug. There you go. This young man right there. Stand up, sir, take a bow. I showed this data on the oil analysis to the head of maintenance for the Commemorative Air Force, fleet of 200 warbirds that he's in charge of. And he said, "Well, what about spark plugs?" And I said, "How many spark plugs are in an R2800? He says 36. I said, "How often do you clean them?" "Every 50 hours. I shoved this picture across the table to him, and I'm going to show you what he did. He sat there at his desk and he looked at this, and he put his finger down on that and said, "That's the fuel I want in all of the airplanes in the Commemorative Air Force." It takes 3 or 4 men 2 or 3 hours to take the cowl off an 826 before they get to the spark plug. And it takes that many more to put it back on. This is a huge change. We may well be able to go annual to annual or double annuals or maybe almost on condition without having to ever pull and clean spark plugs. In addition, our oil change intervals should easily double or triple. And but when we then move to synthetic motor oil, our oil change intervals could easily get out to 150, 200 hours. This is technology that all of us old people are inherently familiar with. When I was 16, 18 years old, we changed the spark plugs over 6,000 or 8,000 miles. We overhauled engines at 70, 80, 90,000 miles in my Pontiac Le Mans. And I hadn't overhauled an engine in the last 20 years. And I don't remember ever paying for a spark plug in the last 20 years. That's what happens when you get rid of the lead.
Hey, George,
Yes.
can you go back one slide? You said that overall, is the overall before those hours or in those hours?
Now, this is at the end of 180 hours, but it's a composite of all the oil samples in between.
You did the overhaul at the end of 180.
No. It was done before we started.
Was there another one?
They hadn't. No, the engines are 3,000 hours from overhaul, or at least the left engine's 3,000 hours from overhaul.
And then was there an annual or anything done?
The annual was done, it was just fine. Lots of borescope pictures. By the way, the gray bar that you see here, that is the universal averages from Blackstone for leaded gas and airplane engines. And you can see that the 100 low lead engine matches the universal averages reasonably closely. Maybe a little better, but that's because they've got probably maybe better operators. So the obvious answer is why it's good news is reduced maintenance costs. There may be more significant benefits. As I mentioned, this data is going to strongly support a request to the FAA for some kind, either an STC or some other kind of approval to dramatically extend the TBOs on our engines. So as I started out in 2023 in October, UND announced that they were stopping the use of Swift UL 94. And the reason, there was a lot of uninformed commentators talking about the use of lead and that kind of stuff. Lycoming came back and suggested the problem was related to the presence of large amounts of aromatic components in Swift UL 94. So we had some communications with the FAA. They wanted us to review our flight manual supplement with respect to its language about intermixing G100 UL and or 100 low lead with UL 94. We got started on that project. And then shortly after that, the FAA came to us and said, we want you to look at your flight manual supplement, your approved existing flight manual supplement, and make a good faith effort to attempt to anticipate the subsequent approval of the two remaining fuels that use ETBE. We thought about it for a while and decided that we had to undertake some research and development to understand it before I, as a DER, could write a report and recommend the approval on the flight manual supplement amendment that is possibly coming down the road. So again, this is the data, or the famous photograph that came out of UND showing the valve seat recession. But this has been researched to death earlier, many years ago. And here's some data from the FAA's Tech Center, where they ran avgas versus autogas. And what you see is they started out and the wear metals were going up and the valve seat recession were going up rapidly. And somewhere at 60, 80, 90 hours, they leveled off and they basically were essentially flat thereafter. It's not my data, that's the FAA's data. Believe the data. This report, which you can find on the internet, states the use of unleaded fuels has not resulted in undue valve seat wear or the acceleration of normal wear. So those historic data points are completely contrary to the claims, data contrary to claims, uninformed claims I would submit, that somehow or another the absence of lead had something to do with the valve seat problems that were encountered at UND. So with that background, it's important that, you got to sit down, be a good scientist, make a list. So we made a list of 3 things that are potentially competent causes. One of those is the absence of lead in UL gas. That was the talking points. The second one, the one we've already discussed, the quality control issues with respect to the metallurgy of the valve seat and or the valve seats in the UND engine. And then the characteristics of the operating combustion events, i.e. potentially detonation in the UND engines running on UL 94. So a few quick words. Many of you have been to the APS class, so this is going to look familiar. But this is a combustion pressure trace that was provided to us by the FAA's Tech Center. This thing here is a normal combustion pressure trace. The way this works, if you're not familiar, is everything over here is the piston going up, and everything over here is the piston coming down. Spark happens, everything over here is the piston going up. This is top dead center. Everything over here is a piston going down. This is a normal combustion event. This is a detonating combustion event. Notice the pressure spike from here to here, but then you get a lot of little other pressure spikes that are a result of a shock wave bouncing back and forth across the top of the piston. In the process, they bounce back and forth across the face of the valves. So another example of this is a composite that includes the same orange trace. The heavy knock is represented by this trace. Now you can take this data sampled at 50,000 samples per second per cylinder, and you can run it through a variety of available mathematical algorithms, and you can assign a number to each individual combustion event that's representative of the intensity of the detonation for that combustion event. We have software that does that. So this is a chart from the Lycoming Operator's Manual, and the reports, which I have verified with UND, are that they ran the engines at peak EGT at cruise in one of those engines. That's just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It puts the cylinder head off of the maximum value here where the blue circle is. Percent power, of course, comes down because they've got a mixture that's below best power, which is out here someplace. And then, of course, for a flight school where economics are everything, they're operating at best economy down here. So those are the conditions they were running. So at 3,000 to 4,000 feet cruise at wide open throttle, 2450 RPM, this is 65 to 70% power. That's important for where we're going with this. So then we're going to study this presentation a little bit. So remember, I told you the computer can calculate in real time and assign a numerical value to the intensity of detonation for each single combustion event. So we teach the computer to do that, and then each one of these dots, which we call a detonation point cloud, represents a single combustion event in a single cylinder, and the dot are color-coded by the cylinder identification. So I can look and see a purple dot and know that it's on cylinder 5, and then the scale is scaled over here to the detonation intensity. These red lines are FAA approved detonation testing thresholds. That's part of the issue paper that defines the detonation means and methods that the FAA approved for fuel projects. So we have replicated this data multiple times. This engine was running, it wasn't running at redline, it was running at 400 to 430. It was not a Lycoming engine, it's a Continental engine. It's an 8.5 to 1 engine. The engine at UND is an 8.5 to 1 compression ratio engine. This engine has 22-degree timing. The engine at UND's got 25-degree timing. And again, it's only running at about 70% of rated power. So this is the engine, and the way this works, this point cloud streams across the page. So these dots over here on the right are things that happened 2.5 minutes ago. And these dots over here are things that happened 2 or 3, 4 seconds ago. So we started running it on G100UL. You can see there's no detonation activity. All we did was flip the toggle switches that switch those solenoid valves. Changed nothing else. And started running on FBO UL94 from Waco, Texas. This would fail an FAA detonation report. Not only that, but this kind of detonation is not going to instantly destroy the engine or anything like it. And I will tell you that I don't think the UND engines were running quite this severely, but they were certainly running severe enough to generate a lot of this kind of stuff. And over time, remember when we looked at the shock wave that's associated with a detonating combustion event, you've got a shock wave bouncing back and forth at 4,000 times per second across the top of the piston, and that shock wave is going past the valves, and every time the shock wave goes past the valves, it bounces the valves by 20 to 100 psi of pressure. As I said, we have replicated this data multiple occasions. Some very, very experienced combustion engineer fuels experts have been present in the test stand and observed the collection of this data. So here is another run, very similar. So again, we started out on either 100 low lead or G100. In this case, we had changed the fuel-air ratio and made it much richer, and that reduced the level of detonation intensity from the cruise mixture setting that was being used at UND. Why did George do that? George did that because he was trying not to destroy the engine. And then it continued from here to here, but here's this thing right here. What the heck happened right there? And what happened right there is we simply turned off one magneto. Now, for those of you that have been to the APS class, you all understand that running an engine on one magneto has the functional effect of retarding the timing on both magnetos if you had both of them retarded by 5 or 6 degrees. If the magnetos on the engines at UND had been timed at 20 or 21 instead of 25, they would have never seen this stuff or this stuff. They would have seen only this kind of stuff. So then we switched from focusing on the UL94 because the FAA asked us to come up with a plan for intermixability, and we decided we need some data. So from the best available public information, we formulated 2 different versions of ETBE-based fuels. This is one of them. It tested with a motor octane of 100.3, and we started out to run it. Now, in this case, you're not going to see fuel on, change fuel. This is all 100 low lead from here to here. This is about 15 seconds. I deliberately wanted to spread it out to get a little more definition. So you can see the engine's running at 31 inches, 2,700 RPM, and it's running really, really rich at 0.72. That's as rich as a Navajo Chieftain. A Continental 550 would normally be at 0.56, 0.58, 0.54. Some Lycomings would be as low as 0.51. So this is what I would refer to as a GAMI-rich mixture. And the CHT line across here is constant, which means there's no detonation because it's not inciting anything. Again, these are FAA thresholds. So here we are running on FBO 100 low lead from the Delic refinery in Tyler, Texas. So then we switch, do nothing else except switch those solenoid valves, and we're running on the ETBE-based fuel chemistry. I started off with the BSFC down here, but trying to do that, but I quickly had to move it up so that it was as rich or richer than before, and even then, it was, you know, at 36 gallons an hour on a 300 horsepower engine, it was still detonate. And it wasn't just one or two cylinders, almost every color on the engine. That's pretty unusual to see that many cylinders detonating at the same time. It's usually one or two and a little bit on the third one. So then we switch fuels again. This is the same exact operating conditions over here as on the 100 low lead. And we switch fuels again, and we're now running the engine, changing nothing over here except the solenoid valve. And just as an experiment, I wanted to see how lean I could get it before it started to detonate. So I started here, I leaned it to here, and I leaned it again to here, got nothing. Completely transparent and detonation resistant regardless of the fuel-air ratio. Folks, data. Believe the data. So this is one of the or the best possible replication of one of the two ETB e-fuels that we know how to produce. Here is another one. It had a MON of only 99.4. This is one that had methanol and manganese. We went back to the former format with this fuel. Over here, the engine's running on 100 low lead with no detonation. Over here, it's running on 100 low lead again. We've rescaled the detonation. Here's the two FAA thresholds. And you can see that when we switch to this ETBE plus methanol plus manganese, there was 4 milligrams per liter of manganese, according to Dixie Labs, in this fuel. Almost immediately, when we switch fuels, you'll notice the CHT. This is the hottest CHT. It was at 435. And as the detonation started, it immediately started climbing. That is absolutely predictable and absolutely confirms that this is detonation that's going on that's causing that. And the only reason it went back down here is because the computer equipment recognized that we were now within 4 degrees of red line on the engine and took over and started enhancing the cooling airflow in order to keep from destroying the engine. Manifold pressure was constant across this whole thing. So at any rate, I could not let anybody I know as a pilot that's a friend of mine fly an 8.5 to 1 compression ratio engine with anything more than about 20-degree timing, and maybe less than that, on this fuel chemistry. Now, maybe whatever they end up approving is going to be different. I don't know that. But what I know is that this, from all of the available public information, very closely resembles the fuel that is remaining in the Eagle program. Many years ago, I had become a personal acquaintance with the then Deputy Administrator, Anthony Broderick. He once told a group of pilots that any applicant could do almost anything, provided only that they had valid data to support their certification project that was pending with the FAA. It was Anthony Broderick that encouraged Tim and I to start the GAMI ejector project. I kept complaining about how hard the STC process was. He kept telling us that we didn't have any right to complain because we didn't have a project. So we opened one, and 4 months later, he had to directly intervene from Washington to get the project unstuck. Are you seeing the data? Anybody thinks they're not seeing data? So in 24 years of doing detonation testing at the Cargill Lake Memorial Engine Test Facility, 24 years, I have never destroyed a cylinder or a piston. I don't know which of the two ETBE fuels were responsible. I've got a pretty good notion, but I'm not going to speculate without studying the data. But after 24 years of never destroying a piston, we managed to do that in less than 5 or 7 hours of test time on ETBE fuels. I cleaned up 1/2 of the piston over here. and got the oil off of it, but you're feel free to come up and inspect it. This is classic for significant or even elevated high levels, heavy levels of detonation that you see when that happens on an engine. There's actually a piece of aluminum that's missing. One of the rings cracked in 3 places and fell off when we took the jug off. So like I say, feel free at the end to come up and lay hands on this and inspect it for yourself. In addition, in 24 years, remember I mentioned all these solenoid valves? They're critical to being able to do reliable testing, to have them working right and not leaking. And after we had had ETBE-based fuel exposed to those solenoid valves, we had 6 of them that failed within a week or 2 of each other. They failed because the diaphragms got stiff and brittle and they started leaking. I don't think it's a coincidence that after 24 years, the only thing that changed was the fuel chemistry. Am I absolutely certain that the change in the fuel chemistry caused those? Not certain, but very close to certain until I see data to the contrary. Those are data. I have them here with me. They are stiff and brittle instead of soft and supple. After looking at these with one of my mechanics, he said, "Wait a minute, George, I want to show you something." And he ran into a back room and he came out. Anybody tell me what this is? Yeah. How many Continental fuel-injected engines and how many Lycoming fuel-injected engines have something like this? Every single one of them. Does that diaphragm look a lot like this diaphragm? It sure does. So somebody's going to have to prove otherwise with respect to this diaphragm. Again, data. I mean, 24 years, those solenoid valves. I checked with some people at 2 different major oil companies, and when they started using ETBE is an ether. Ethyl tert butyl ether, MTBE. MTBE that we all had in our car gas for a while is another ether. And when the refining industry started dealing with the ether fuels, they had a whole bunch of solenoid valves. These are called red hat solenoid valves. And they all started leaking when they got exposed to the ethers, 30 years ago. This is less than 6 weeks of exposure. Again, it's data. So some summary real quick. The UL94 avgas is likely not suitable for 8.5 to 1 engines with 25-degree spark advance. And this is a potential safety of flight issue. And there is a formal written report approved by the propulsion engineers in the FAA that has been submitted to the FAA and is now data that has been accepted by the administrator. A further evaluation by Lycoming of this situation is warranted, consistent with the results of the detonation testing here. I'm anticipating being able to sit down with Lycoming and meet with them here at Oshkosh. Solution to this problem, if you're going to continue to use 94UL, you need to modify the engines and retard the timing. I think if it was retarded to 20, maybe 21, maybe possibly 22, but more likely 20, then that would eliminate the safety of flight issue that is raised, documented by this data, for which, so far as I know, there is no available contrary data. So part 2A and B, those were the 2 identified ETBE-based fuel chemistries that are seeking FAA approval. They're likely, based on this data, only going to be acceptable. And again, the final version of the fuels may be different. If they are, I'll be glad to rerun the testing. But based on this data, they're likely only going to be acceptable for a very small portion of the fleet of engine and aircraft, and otherwise only on any larger portion after substantial modifications to the engines or to the operating conditions. Okay, we're going to restrict the manifold pressure to 25 inches on takeoff. Or you're going to have to retard all the spark timing to 5 degrees. Or we're going to reduce the maximum cylinder head temperature from 460 to 420, or from 500 to 430. And oh, by the way, you can't take off when the outside air temperature is over 95 degrees. You can, as an engineer, you can conjure up all kinds of things that might be able to be done. Continuing with the two ETBE fuels, almost certainly, the high-powered turbocharged airplanes, Navajo Chieftains, turbocharged Bonanzas, Cessna 210s, turbo-normalized Cirrus SR-22Ts, they're not really going to be able to operate on these fuels without, again, significant modifications. And of course, this is categorically definitive evidence of the safety of flight issue. So, the third part of the report, this was added onto the report when we started discovering these material compatibility issues. There's been over 23 years of trouble-free service out of these components, having been exposed not only to Hunter low lead, but having been exposed to G100UL in 50 different variations, and having been exposed to an almost indefinite number of other fuel chemistries that came to us during the mid-2000 time frame from the refiners I mentioned earlier. Pardon? Yeah, it's a microphone, folks, so let me try a little. So, like I say, all these components have been subjected to a vast array of fuel chemistries, and I cannot imagine that it's not causally related. Their failure, I think there were 6, maybe 8 of them that failed almost simultaneously. The ones that did not fail had not been exposed to ETB fuel chemistries. This is just a flashback. Believe the data, until some stakeholder in the unleaded avgas transition, quote, community, sometimes wonder how much of a community it is, can produce and offer for public scrutiny contrary or conflicting data of comparable quality, and which is subsequently reviewed and accepted by the FAA as part of an FAA-approved unleaded avgas data package, or even potentially by an ASTM research report that's approved by balloting, then the conclusions stated above are, in GAMI's judgment, my judgment as an FAA engine power plant flight test DER, and multiple others, the only conclusions on the subject of the acceptable use of EL94 and the ETBE fuel chemistries that are so far based on hard data. Questions, anybody? Pardon? Road tags. So what? They run fine. Next question. Yellow shirt. I'm getting old and hard of hearing. Why don't you stand up and speak louder? I will.
Did the FAA pay for that study?
FAA has never offered to pay us a penny to do anything, okay? We did that because the FAA had tasked us with having to write an engineering report to substantiate potential changes to the flight manual supplement. And rather than just waving our hands and saying, well, we think we ought to do this, it was really important that we have data to support it. All of this data has been shared with the FAA, including the FAA at senior management level. Next question. So I don't, you know, that's an interesting academic question. It's not my problem. It's not my problem to solve. I will tell you that these results on this 95 octane unleaded fuel are completely consistent with 10 years of research that we did on a 96.5 motor octane unleaded fuel that was produced by one of the major refiners. They shipped us 3,000 gallons. We tested it for about 3 years. So these results are completely consistent with our 24-year history of doing detonation testing on that test stand. Other question, right here, sir. Let me get a little closer. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that a foreign country had approved
Yes.
STC. Can you advise which country?
So the question is which foreign country has approved the STC? And I'm not yet allowed to disclose that. Good question. Next question. Somebody? Yes, sir, with the hat on.
Yeah, you mentioned one of the fuels you tested earlier contained manganese. I was just wondering if there was manganese in the G100 UL.
No, there are no metals, no organic metallic compounds of any kind whatsoever in G100 UL. Okay? Manganese is a potential serious issue. All right. Mr. Bush.
Could you talk a little about FAA approval versus ASTM and the whole data thing?
Sure. So the question is there's this controversy, you know, about, well, ASTM and FAA. If you go to our website, there's a series of frequently asked questions, and the entire G100 UL aviation spec, revision -12C9, is on there. And if you go down to the appendix documents and read down in paragraph, I think I've got this, X1.1.4 and 1.1.5, you will find an explicit statement that based on its obligations under its regulations and its advisory circular, that the FAA has made, and this is the word in this that the FAA used, made a determination that the FAA approved specification for G100 UL is not only the equivalent of an ASTM specification for 100 low lead, but is actually an enhanced specification for that. So I hope that settles this controversy about ASTM. Thank you, Chris, for your patience. Yep, thank you, Chris. I mean, look, he may not like the truth of the matter, but it's on the website. Go read it for yourself. And if what I'm telling you is not true, then send me a bouquet of black roses. My wife does not like black roses. Any rate, there are reasons we did not go to ASTM. One of the reasons we didn't is that their projects take forever. Tim mentioned to me a minute ago that there's been a process there to get an approval just for how you make ETBE, and it took 10 years just to get a spec to say, well, this is an acceptable version of an ETBE. We did, in fact, go to ASTM and present this at the request of the FAA in June of 2010. We asked them to let us use modern state-of-the-art laboratory methods instead of their antiquated 70-year-old laboratory methods to define the fuel, which is basically a detailed hydrocarbon analysis. Every batch of G100 UL has what I call a DNA fingerprint of the molecules in the fuel. If we're talking about analyzing the molecules down to less than 1/100th of 1%. You get a list of 300 or 400 molecules that are in the fuel when you run one of these. That creates an absolutely valuable traceability, because if the fuel goes through the supply chain to the airport, gets put in the airplane, and the pilot takes off and runs into a mountain in a snowstorm and the family sues the FBO claiming the fuel was bad, if the NTSB can go to the scene of the accident and they can recover that much fuel in a thimble out of a fuel line, a fuel spider, a fuel tank, they can go back to the original place that ran the detailed hydrocarbon analysis. It's run according to an ASTM spec, D6700 and/or D6733. They're not grossly expensive to run, and it will print out again the molecular composition of the fuel found at the scene of the accident, and it can be compared to the fuel as it was conformed. Even if the fuel has been commingled with 100 low lead, there are ratios of the molecules that are in this fuel so that you can parse out, sort of like, you know, looking at a DNA plot for a grandchild and asking who the grandfather is. We can do the same sort of thing with the molecular analysis that comes with each batch of this fuel. Another question?
What are the economic, if you want to get general acceptance of the fleet or the FBOs, what is the economic implications to get them to actually make it?
Very good question. And it gets off into a variety of issues. Like I say, the fuel is commercially available. Some of the distributors that are subject to the consent decree in California are trying to quibble over what the meaning of commercially available is. But at an FAA Eagle meeting about 4 months ago, one of the primary participants was asked that question, and his response was, well, if I can order it and I can get it, it's commercially available. You can order it and you can get it. Any one of those distributors could have had this fuel at every one of their FBOs 8 weeks ago, if they wanted to. They, in my judgment, are inventing excuses to not do that, which is why I asked for all the people in California to get one of these cards and fill it out and get us some data if you're interested in having fuel coming to your airport in California. So the other question, part of your question, was about the economics of the fuel. I've mentioned this in public before, I'll do it again. Right now, if you're a purchaser, a distributor, a wholesaler of 100 low lead, and you price a rail car load of 100 low lead on the Gulf Coast market, as an example, what you're going to pay for it is the premium unleaded auto gas price plus $1, plus or minus 15 cents. It's about $1 over premium unleaded car gas wholesale. This fuel is going to cost about $2 a gallon more than premium unleaded car gas in the same market. The difference is not going into Tim Rail's pocket. The difference is the cost of the components. To do this without the lead, it takes premium components and they cost premium prices. Did I answer your question, sir?
How do you incentivize the FBOs to make the change?
I think that at least in 8 or 9 states that have contacted us, that if the FBOs, I mean, the FBOs are not the problem. Some of the FBOs are asking their distributor for the fuel. The problem is 4 distributors, 5 distributors, 6. There's 4 bigger ones and 2 smaller ones that own 95% of the market. And for some reason, and they've all told us that they're fine with the spec, they've reviewed it, they've all got product liability insurance. Anything you hear about, well, we don't have insurance, that's nonsense. Every one of them has told us that they've been to their underwriter, been to Lloyd's, and Lloyd's said, if the FAA approves the fuel, we'll insure it, no change in premium. And that includes VTOL Aviation, which is one of the largest jet fuel distributors in the world. They got the same result when they went to their liability carrier about starting to sell aviation gasoline. So I think the FBOs are wanting it, but they've got contractual arrangements, and frankly, they're scared to death of offending their distributor, who they rely upon. And so I think the issue is parallel activity by the distributors in deciding not yet to move fuel to the market. Did I now answer your question to your satisfaction? Not to any of us' satisfaction. Agreed. Other questions? Anybody? Yes, sir, Mr. Bush.
You use P100UL, you need FTC. How do you get it? What does it cost?
Okay, so yes, you need an STC. You can get out your iPad or your iPhone or your computer, go to the GAMI website. It might take, if you've got the serial number off the engine or engines, almost everything else is automated from the FAA's database. You put in your VIN number, feed it the serial numbers of the engine or engines, and you can probably do that in less than 20 minutes, maybe less than 15 minutes. The pricing formula, there's a base price for the airframe, and it's unfortunately more complicated than I would have liked, but it ends up averaging about $1.75 a horsepower. So figure you're probably going to pay about what, if you got a long-range airplane, you're probably going to pay about what you'd pay to fill up your fuel tanks to go on the next long trip. Did I answer your question?
And you need placards.
Yeah, so the way this works practically, and it's really important, thank you, is we mail out a set of placards. You got to fill out a form or have a mechanic fill out a form 337. He's got to hand it to you, and it's got to be mailed into Oklahoma City within the next 30 days, I think. And the placards have to be put on. There's a flight manual supplement that gets downloaded, instructions for continued airworthiness that gets downloaded. We have had a request in for nearly 3 years to the FAA to create a streamlined STC process so that all you have to do is have the legal right to use the fuel, documented on your iPhone, and you don't have to complete the paperwork till the next scheduled maintenance event, i.e. the next annual inspection, okay? And the FAA has promised us multiple times that they had a way to do that, most recently in a face-to-face meeting in January of this year with the senior FAA Eagle person. And he told us as we got ready to leave 800 Independence Avenue in Washington that yes, there was a way to do this and the FAA would do it. It hasn't been done yet. So that would greatly simplify the process. The placards are important because of some potential misfueling issues, but they're not safety critical because this fuel can be mixed with any other currently approved fuel for use in an airplane that's currently approved to use 100 low lead or even UL94. Yes, sir.
Any talk of VTOL directly distributing this to FBOs?
So the question, very perceptive by the way, give this man a prize. There is discussions, and VTOL I think is on the verge of becoming, I mean these four big distributors, it's almost business 101 suicide. They're inviting a company that's many times larger than they are to become their direct competitor by distributing the fuel directly if the distributors don't take the fuel. And you know, I can think of writing a really lousy master's thesis on what a bad decision that would be if the existing distributors decided to do that if I was a second-year MBA student at Stanford or Harvard. Yes, sir.
Is VTOL at Oshkosh?
Yes.
Oh.
They've been here for the last 4 days. They've met with me. They've met with the FAA.
Are they in this room?
No, the guy from VTOL brought his 9-year-old son with him, and he was only scheduled to be here from Saturday through this morning.
I think we need to have a chat with them.
Well, I can arrange a Zoom call if anybody's interested. Sure can do that. I will tell you that he is currently negotiating directly with several FBOs. And there is one other smaller distributor that is desperate to expand their market. And they are in the process of trying to come forward and act as a distributor in this process. Any other questions? Going to wrap up here. Thank you all very much. Oh, you're all invited to come inspect this piston. Come inspect the piston.
Thank you, George.